What are you doing here?
We need to talk. It's important.
The scent of sterile antiseptic always reminded Lim Jae-sub of a morgue, or a boardroom, two places where mistakes went to die. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal overcoat, his tattooed fingers grazing the silk lining, a subtle reminder of the skin he'd tried so hard to shed. He wasn't supposed to be on the 4th floor of this private New Jersey clinic. He was supposed to be finalizing a merger that would bury his family's mafia reputation under layers of legitimate corporate gold. But a tip-off lead about a compromised associate led him here, to a door that should have remained closed. Jae-sub pushed the heavy oak paneling open, his expression a mask of cold, dangerous elegance. He expected to see a trembling informant. Instead, the air left his lungs. Standing by the window, bathed in the harsh, clinical light of the recovery room, was Cassidy Thorne. The hospital gown she wore looked thin, making her appear more fragile than the woman he remembered from 7 years ago in Seoul. Yet her eyes held the same defiant fire that had once nearly burned his world down. Cassidy didn't scream. She didn't move. She simply gripped the doorframe, her knuckles turning a ghostly white against her deep complexion. The silence between them wasn't just heavy. It was a physical weight, pressurized by years of unspoken apologies and a debt that had never been settled. Jae-sub. Her voice was a cracked whisper, a ghost surfacing in a place where only the living were supposed to hide. He didn't answer immediately. He couldn't, because in that single, shattering moment of recognition, Jae-sub realized that the woman he had once loved was the same whistleblower currently holding the detonator to his family's entire future. The hum of the HVAC system was the only thing filling the void between them. Jae-sub stepped fully into the room, the click of his Italian leather shoes sounding like a gavel on the linoleum floor. He watched the way Cassidy's chest rose and fell, rapid, shallow, terrified. "You're supposed to be in London," he said, his voice dropping into that low, melodic baritone that used to soothe her during the rainy seasons in Gyeonggi. "My people tracked your passport to Heathrow 3 years ago, and then the trail went cold." Cassidy's grip on the doorframe tightened. "I learned how to disappear, Jae-sub. I had to, especially after what your father's advisors told me would happen if I ever stepped foot back in South Korea." She took a shaky breath, her eyes scanning his face, lingering on the dark ink that crawled up his neck, a permanent mark of the life he had promised her he would leave behind. "You didn't leave, did you? You just traded the street for a skyscraper." Jae-sub felt a familiar sting of resentment, but he suppressed it. He was a man of calculated movements now. "The world isn't as simple as we thought it was at 24, Cassidy. Power doesn't just vanish because you want to be good. It just changes shape." He looked around the room, no flowers, no cards, just a laptop and a stack of legal documents on the bedside table. "What are you doing here? This clinic is for people who don't want to be found by the authorities." "I am the authorities' best hope," she snapped, her voice regaining its edge. "And I'm not hiding from the law. I'm hiding from the people you do business with, the Vane Group. Does that name ring a bell, or do you have too many shells in your ocean to keep track?" The blood in Jae-sub's veins turned to ice. The Vane Group was the primary architect of his upcoming merger. If they fell, his legitimacy fell with them. If Cassidy was the one pulling the thread, he was standing in a room with his own executioner. "Cassidy, tell me you aren't the primary witness in the Vane embezzlement suit." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "I'm not just the witness, Jae-sub. I'm the one who built the digital trail. I'm the one who's going to make sure that empire turns to dust." He looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't the girl who used to study architecture in the cafes of Hongdae anymore. She was a woman who had survived the worst of his world and come out the other side with a weapon. "If my family finds out you're here," Jae-sub whispered, his eyes darting to the hallway where his security detail waited, "they won't see a woman from my past. They'll see a liability that needs to be liquidated before the market opens on Monday." "Then do it," she challenged, stepping away from the door and standing her ground. "Finish what your father started 7 years ago, or are you still just a man in a very expensive cage?" The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. Seoul, 2019. A small, cramped apartment overlooking the Han River, where the smell of rain and cheap convenience store ramyeon had felt like luxury because she was there. Jae-sub remembered the night he had told her who his father really was. He had expected her to run. Instead, she had held his hand and told him that a name wasn't a destiny. But he had been naive. He hadn't realized that in his world, love was a luxury tax he couldn't afford to pay. His father, Lim Sang-hoon, hadn't used violence to separate them. He had used something much worse, a social erasure. He had ensured Cassidy's scholarship was revoked, her visa questioned, and her family's small business back in the States buried under regulatory audits. Jae-sub had been forced to watch her life dismantle piece by piece until he finally did the only kind thing he could. He told her he didn't love her. He told her she was a distraction. He watched her board that plane with eyes full of hate, and he had used that hate to fuel his climb to the top of the Lim Group. Now, 7 years later, the debt was coming due. "I didn't have a choice then, Cassidy," Jae-sub said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the hospital monitors. "Everyone has a choice, Jae-sub. You chose the throne, I chose the truth." She walked over to the bed, her movements stiff. She picked up a thick folder from the nightstand. "I know about the merger. I know the Lim Group is trying to go public by absorbing Vane's logistics wing. It's a brilliant move, on paper. It washes the money, hides the history, and makes you the king of East Coast shipping." She tossed the folder onto the bedspread. "But the money Vane is using to fund that merger, it's stolen from the pension funds of 30,000 municipal workers, people like my father, people who worked 40 years just to have it evaporated by men in tailored black overcoats." Jae-sub looked at the folder, but he didn't touch it. He knew what was inside. He had suspected the Vane Group's liquidity was too good to be true, but he had looked the other way because it was his ticket out of the underworld. "If I help you," Jae-sub started, his mind racing through 1,000 corporate permutations, "I don't just lose the merger. I lose the protection of the board. My uncles, Seo Jin-ho and Park Kyung-teek, they've been waiting for me to slip. They want the old ways back. They want the blood and the fear. If I cost them this deal for a woman from the past, they'll remove me before the ink is dry." "Then let them," Cassidy said, her voice softening just a fraction. "Be the man you promised you'd be in that apartment in Seoul. Not for me, but for once, Jae-sub, do it for yourself." The door to the room creaked. Jae-sub's head snapped toward the entrance. His lead security man, a cold-eyed veteran named Ro Kangdi, stood in the doorway. "Boss," Kangdi said, his eyes scanning the room, landing on Cassidy with a chilling neutrality. "The car is ready, and your uncle is calling. He says there's a leak in the Vane case. He wants to know if we've found the problem yet." The ride back to the Lim Group's Manhattan headquarters was silent. Jae-sub stared out the window of the armored Maybach, the city lights blurring into long, jagged streaks of neon. Beside him, his phone buzzed incessantly. Seo Jin-ho, his eldest uncle, the man who still kept a scarred knuckle duster in his desk drawer as a paperweight. Jae-sub finally picked up. "I'm on my way, uncle." "The hospital was a waste of time, then?" Jin-ho's voice was like gravel grinding together. "We heard the girl was there. The one the Vane people are so worried about. A little bird told me she's an old friend of yours, Jae-sub. Is that true?" Jae-sub's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles ached. "She's a witness, nothing more. I'm handling it." "Handle it quickly," Jin-ho warned. "The merger is set for Monday morning. If that girl talks to the feds before then, we aren't just out of a deal. We're in a RICO investigation. And you know how I feel about lawyers, Jae-sub. They're much harder to bury than witnesses." The call ended. Jae-sub looked at Kangdi, who was watching him through the rearview mirror. "Kangdi," Jae-sub said quietly, "how many men are at the clinic?" "4, boss. Why?" "Triple it, but they aren't there to handle anyone. If a single person from the Vane Group or my uncle's faction gets within a block of that room, I want to know." And Kangdi. "Yes, boss. If anything happens to her, don't bother coming back to the office." When Jae-sub entered the boardroom on the 62nd floor, the atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and old-world aggression. 3 men sat around a table made of reclaimed mahogany: Seo Jinho, Park Kyung-teek, and a new face, a representative from the vain group named Elias Thorne, no relation to Cassidy, a cruel irony. "We were just discussing the leak," Jinho said, leaning back. "Mr. Thorne here says the girl is recovering from a minor surgery, a perfect window of opportunity. No one asks questions when a patient has complications." Jae-sub walked to the head of the table, not sitting, but leaning his palms on the wood. He looked directly at Elias. "The Vane Group has spent the last decade stealing from the public. You think I'm going to let you add a state-sponsored murder to my ledger right before I take this company public?" "It's not murder, Mr. Lim," Elias said smoothly. "It's risk management. In my company," Jae-sub's voice dropped to a whisper that commanded more attention than a shout, "I manage the risk. And the risk right now isn't the girl. It's the fact that your books are so dirty they're staining my floor." He turned to his uncle. "The merger stays on schedule, but we change the terms. We don't absorb Vane, we liquidate them. We take their assets, we settle their debts, and we cooperate with the investigation as whistleblower partners. We wash the name by being the ones who brought the criminals to justice." Jinho stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "You'd betray our partners. You'd hand over the books to the feds. You're burning the house down to save a mouse in the wall." "I'm burning the house down because it's infested with rot, uncle," Jae-sub replied, his eyes cold and unwavering. "And if you try to stop me, you'll find out exactly why my father left the company to me and not you." The silence that followed was a declaration of war. Jae-sub knew he had just placed a target on his back. But as he looked at the city below, all he could think about was the woman in room 402 and the 7 years of silence he was finally ready to break. The hospital at 3:00 a.m. felt like a pressurized chamber. Jae-sub bypassed the night nurse, his presence alone acting as a silent command to remain seated. When he pushed into room 402, the lights were dimmed, but Cassidy wasn't sleeping. She was sitting upright, the blue glow of her laptop illuminating the sharp, tired contours of her face. "You're back," she said, not looking up. "Did you come to tell me the price for my silence? Or are you here to see if I've survived the complications your uncle was discussing?" Jae-sub didn't sit. He stood at the foot of her bed, his overcoat still smelling of cold rain and expensive tobacco. "I'm here because the Vane Group wants you dead by sunrise, and my uncle is currently holding a vote to see if I should be the one to do it." Cassidy finally looked up, her fingers pausing over the keys. "And how did the vote go?" "I told them I'd manage the risk," he replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a specialized encrypted drive. He set it on the bedside table with a muted clack. "That contains the internal ledger of the Lim Group's logistics wing. Every shell company, every offshore account we used to facilitate the Vane merger. It's the missing piece of your puzzle." Cassidy stared at the drive as if it were a live grenade. "Why? This doesn't just destroy Vane, Jae-sub. This cripples you. You'll be tied to this for years in court. Your legitimacy will be dead before it starts." "I'm tired of building on sand, Cassidy," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, honest whisper. He walked to the window, looking out at the darkened parking lot where his security detail moved like shadows. "I spent 7 years trying to prove to my father, and then to his ghost, that I could be the king he wanted. But looking at you today, I realized I've just been a very well-dressed janitor cleaning up other people's messes." Cassidy stood up slowly, clutching her IV pole for support. She walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the floor. "Is this an apology?" "No, it's a partnership," Jae-sub said, turning to face her. The distance between them was barely a foot. The clinical smell of the room faded, replaced by the heavy electric tension of 2 people who had been orbitally locked for a decade. "I'm not going to save you, Cassidy. You've already saved yourself. But I can give you the ammunition to make sure neither of us ever has to run again. If we do this, we go to the feds together. Not as a witness and a defendant, but as co-conspirators in the truth." She looked into his eyes. Searching for the lie, for the mafia boss she had expected him to be. She found only the man from the Seoul apartment, older, scarred, but finally awake. "If we do this," she whispered, her hand hovering near his tattooed wrist. There's no going back to the skyscrapers. You know that, right? I'd rather have a small room with a view of the truth than a penthouse built on a graveyard, he replied. Their moment was shattered by a sharp vibration from Jae-sub's pocket. He pulled out his phone. A single text from Kang-di. Uncle's moving. They aren't waiting for Monday. They're coming to the clinic now. We have to move. Now, Jae-sub said, his voice switching back to the clipped, authoritative tone of a leader. He grabbed her coat from the closet and draped it over her hospital gown. What's happening? Cassidy asked, her adrenaline spiking. The board didn't like my restructuring plan. They've decided to cut the middleman, which, in this case, is me. He grabbed her laptop and the encrypted drive, stuffing them into his bag. They exited the room just as the elevator at the end of the hall dinged. Jae-sub pulled Cassidy into the service stairwell, the heavy metal door clicking shut just as 3 men in dark suits stepped onto the floor. In the dim, yellow light of the stairwell, Jae-sub leaned against the concrete wall, checking his sidearm, a habit he hated but couldn't shake. Listen to me. There's a safe house in upstate New York. It's registered under a name my family doesn't know, a name from my mother's side. We go there, we upload the data to the federal server, and we wait for the warrants to drop. And then what? Cassidy asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. You think your uncle is just going to let you walk into a courtroom? He won't have a choice, Jae-sub said. The moment that data hits the server, a kill switch is activated. If anything happens to us, a second set of files that implicate the entire board in a 20-year racketeering scheme, gets sent to every major news outlet in the country. It's mutually assured destruction. He looked at her, his expression softening for the first time. It's the ultimate social gamble, Cassidy. I'm betting my entire reputation, my family's name, and my freedom on the hope that you still trust me enough to finish this. Cassidy looked at the door they had just exited, then back at him. She realized then that this wasn't about a crime or a rescue. It was about a choice. He was offering her the power to destroy him, and in doing so, he was giving her the only thing he had left, his life. I don't trust the boss, she said, stepping closer to him in the cramped stairwell. But I trust the man who used to share his ramyun with me when we had nothing. Let's go. They descended the stairs, bypassing the lobby and exiting through the ambulance bay, where Kang-di was waiting with a nondescript black SUV, the engine idling like a low growl in the night. As they sped away from the clinic, Jae-sub watched the hospital recede in the rearview mirror. He was no longer a wealthy boss or a feared man of the underworld. For the first time in 7 years, he was just a man sitting next to the woman he should have never let go. The safe house was a modest stone cottage tucked away in the dense woods of the Hudson Valley. It was quiet, the air smelling of pine and damp earth, a far cry from the exhaust-choked streets of Manhattan. Inside, the tension didn't dissipate, it just changed form. While Cassidy worked on the laptop, cross-referencing Jae-sub's ledgers with her own digital evidence, Jae-sub sat by the window with a burner phone, monitoring the fallout. It's starting, he said, his voice tight. My uncle has frozen my personal accounts. He's told the board I've suffered a mental break and that I'm being held for my own safety. He's trying to discredit me before I can even speak. Cassidy didn't look up from the screen. Let him. The numbers don't have a reputation, Jae-sub. They just have a bottom line. I've almost got the vein-limb connection mapped out, but there's a problem. Jae-sub walked over to the desk. What is it? There's a ghost entry, she said, pointing to a recurring payment hidden in the logistics insurance files. A monthly disbursement to a company called SJH Holdings. It's been happening for 15 years. It's a massive amount of money. And it's not coming from the mafia side. It's coming from the legitimate side. Jae-sub looked at the initials. SJH CO Jinho. His uncle hadn't just been a thug. He had been skimming from the legitimate company long before Jae-sub took over. He had been stealing from the family he claimed to protect. He's not protecting the legacy, Jae-sub realized, a cold anger settling in his gut. He's protecting his own private retirement fund. He doesn't care about the merger for the family. He needs it to cover the hole he's been digging for a decade. Suddenly, the burner phone in Jae-sub's hand rang. It was an unknown number. He answered, putting it on speaker. "You're a hard man to find, nephew," Seo Jin-ho's voice crackled. He sounded calm, which was more terrifying than his rage. "But you forgot one thing, the car you took from the hospital. The tires have GPS sensors embedded in the rubber. A little trick I learned from our friends in Seoul." Jae-sub looked at Cassidy. Her eyes went wide. "I'm not coming there to kill you, Jae-sub," Jin-ho continued. "I'm coming there to give you one last chance. Give me the girl, give me the drive, and you can go back to being the face of the company. I'll even let you keep the girl's life. We'll just send her somewhere very far away, somewhere with no internet." "And if I refuse?" Jae-sub asked. "Then I'll remind you why people were afraid of the Lim name long before you started wearing three-piece suits. I'm 10 minutes away, Jae-sub. Make your choice." The line went dead. Jae-sub looked at Cassidy. There was no more time for strategy or legal maneuvers. The high-stakes social decision was no longer about a boardroom. It was about the next 10 minutes of their lives. "Kang-di is outside," Jae-sub said, his voice steady. "He'll take you through the backwoods to a secondary vehicle. You have to take the laptop and go. If you're caught with me, it's over." "No," Cassidy said, standing up and closing the laptop. "I'm tired of running and you're tired of being alone. We stay. We finish the upload together. If he wants to come into this house, he's going to have to do it while the entire world is watching." She pointed to the screen. "Upload 92% complete." 7 minutes, she said. "We just need 7 minutes." The sound of gravel crunching under heavy tires echoed through the valley like a series of gunshots. Jae-sub stood by the heavy oak door of the cottage, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon, not out of malice, but out of a grim necessity he had hoped to outrun. Through the window. The headlights of 3 black SUVs cut through the Hudson mist, illuminating the trees in jagged flashes of white. 88%, Cassidy whispered from the desk. The progress bar on the screen felt like it was moving through molasses. Her fingers were flying across the keys, her brow beaded with sweat. "The encryption is slowing down the uplink. Jae-sub, if they cut the power to the house, the handshake fails. We'll lose everything." Jae-sub looked at the electrical box on the exterior wall through the glass. "They won't cut the power yet. My uncle is a man of ego. He wants to see the look in my eyes when I surrender. He thinks this is a Shakespearean tragedy where the young prince realizes he's outmatched." He turned to her, his silhouette tall and imposing against the flickering light of the laptop. "Keep your head down. No matter what you hear, do not stop that upload." Jae-sub stepped out onto the porch just as Seo Jin-ho emerged from the lead vehicle. The older man looked remarkably composed, wearing a trench coat that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Behind him stood 6 men, not the polished corporate security Jae-sub employed, but the old guard. Men with scarred faces and eyes that had seen the bottom of the Han River. "You always were a romantic, Jae-sub," Jin-ho called out, his voice echoing in the crisp night air. "Even as a boy, you'd cry over a broken bird. But this is a broken empire. You're trading a billion-dollar legacy for a girl who's going to leave you the moment she feels safe again." "She's not a girl, uncle. She's the consequence of every shortcut you've ever taken," Jae-sub replied, his voice steady. He stepped off the porch, placing himself between the house and the men. "I know about SJH Holdings. I know you've been bleeding the Lim Group dry for 15 years to pay off your gambling debts in Macau. The merger wasn't for the family. It was your bailout." The mask of composure on Jin-ho's face cracked. The men behind him shifted uncomfortably. In their world, stealing from the family was the one unforgivable sin. "You're bluffing," Jin-ho hissed. "Check your phone, uncle. I just sent the bank statements to every man standing behind you. I don't need a gun to destroy you. I just need the truth." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the yard. The men behind Jin-ho began to look at one another. Jae-sub wasn't fighting with bullets. He was dismantling their loyalty with a single, devastating social truth. Inside, the laptop chimed. Upload 96%. The tension in the yard was a physical weight, a thin cord stretched to the point of snapping. Jinho realized he was losing his grip. He lunged forward, not with a weapon, but with the desperation of a man watching his life's work evaporate. "You think they care about bank statements?" Jinho roared. "They care about power, and I'm the one who provides it." "You provide nothing but debt," Jae-sub countered, stepping forward to meet him. "The Vane Group is already being raided. The FBI is at the Manhattan office as we speak. If you walk into that house, you aren't just killing a witness. You're signing your own death warrant on a federal camera." Just then, the front door of the cottage creaked open. Cassidy stood there, the laptop held in both hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "It's done," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "The files are in the hands of the Southern District of New York, and the secondary server is live. If any of us don't check in by 6:00 a.m., the SJH Holdings files go to the Gyeonggi Provincial Police. You aren't just a thief here, Jinho. You're a fugitive in Korea, too." One by one, the men behind Jinho lowered their gaze. They were loyal to the Lim name, but they weren't martyrs for a man who had been stealing from their pockets. "Boss," Kangdi said, stepping forward from the shadows of the porch where he had been stationed. He looked at Jae-sub, then at Jinho. He didn't raise his weapon. He simply walked over to Jae-sub's side. "The cars are registered to the company. The company is currently under federal freeze. We're leaving." The other men followed suit, retreating to the vehicles. Jinho stood alone in the center of the yard, his expensive coat suddenly looking like a shroud. He looked at Jae-sub, the nephew he had tried to mold, the man he had tried to break, and saw a strength that didn't come from a gun or a title. "You've ruined us," Jinho whispered. "No," Jae-sub said, walking up to him until they were inches apart. "I've ended us. There's a difference." He turned back to Cassidy. She was still holding the laptop, her body shaking slightly from the release of adrenaline. Jae-sub walked up the stairs, took the computer from her hands, and set it on the porch railing. He didn't care about the SUVs speeding away or the siren of the distant police cars that were surely on their way. He reached out and took her hand. Her skin was cold, but her grip was firm. "It's over," he said. "Not yet," she replied, looking at the horizon where the first hint of gray was beginning to bleed into the sky. "Now comes the hard part. We have to figure out who we are without the war." 6 months later. The courtroom in Manhattan was quiet, a stark contrast to the media circus that had surrounded the Lim Vane fall. The headlines had been relentless. Mob boss turns informant, the end of the shipping dynasty, the woman who broke the mafia. Jae-sub sat on a wooden bench in the hallway, his charcoal overcoat draped over his lap. He no longer wore the tailored three-piece suits of a CEO. He was dressed in a simple navy sweater and dark trousers. The mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man who had spent the last half-year in depositions, liquidating assets, and ensuring that every pension fund stolen by Vane was repaid in full. The door to the courtroom opened, and Cassidy stepped out. She looked different. She wore a sharp, professional blazer, her hair pulled back in a sleek bun. She was no longer a patient in a patterned robe or a girl in a rainy Seoul apartment. She was a consultant for a firm specializing in corporate ethics, a role she had earned through fire. She saw him and smiled, a genuine, tired expression that reached her eyes. "The judge accepted the final settlement," she said, sitting down beside him. "The Lim Group is officially dissolved. The logistics wing is being restructured as a worker-owned cooperative. You're officially unemployed." "And the investigation into my family?" Jae-sub asked. "Closed. Your cooperation was enough to grant immunity for the historical crimes, as long as you stay out of the industry for 10 years. She bumped her shoulder against his. "I think you can find something else to do with your time." Jae-sub looked down at his hands. The tattoos were still there, the neck ink, the symbols on his fingers, but they no longer felt like shackles. They were just part of his history. A map of where he had been. "I was thinking of opening that architecture firm," he said quietly. "The one we talked about in Hongdae, small scale, sustainable, no boardrooms, no secrets." Cassidy looked at him, her heart swelling with a quiet, earned peace. I know a very good compliance officer who's looking for a new project. She's tough, she doesn't take bribes, and she has a history with the lead architect. They walked out of the courthouse together, stepping into the bright, chaotic energy of New York City. There were no black SUVs waiting for them, no security detail, no shadows. Just the two of them, lost in the crowd of thousands of people who had no idea who they were. As they reached the corner, Jae-sub paused. He looked at Cassidy, the woman who had opened a door 7 years ago and never truly left his heart. You know, he said, a touch of his old wit returning to his voice, technically, I'm still a man from your past. Does that make this a cliché? Cassidy laughed, a clear, bright sound that echoed off the glass buildings. She reached out, interlacing her fingers with his, the ink of his tattoos meeting the warmth of her palm. No, Jae-sub, she said, pulling him toward the subway. The past is just the prologue. This is the story. They disappeared into the city, two people who had gambled everything on a single choice and finally won a life that was entirely their own.